Now you notice that the computer identified 3 cylinders, 353, 55, and 56. So we've got at least 3 cylinders that have a problem. Let's get a little bit more specific and see if we can narrow that down a little bit. So what would you want to do next in order to narrow it down, and why? My next step would be to perform a power balance test. Power balance. Now when it is running this power balance, you can see that it has the firing order right there. It starts with the blue line, it just continues, and every time it paints a new trace, it makes it in gray. That way you can see if it's consistent or if there's glitches, or if one cylinder or the other one is the problem. Now in this case, cylinder 5 and 3. 5 is contributing the least to power. Now 3 possibly could be in response to 5 because since this is low, it may not have enough time to recover. But 1, 4, 2, and 6 are contributing fairly equally. 5 and 3 are a problem. Now 4, 5, and 6 are on the same bank of the engine. 3 is on the other one. So at this time, I'm going to focus on 5 as our problem. 3 is taking a while to respond to 5 being bad. But 1, 4, 2, and 6 are contributing equally to power. What else would you want to do to narrow it down, and why? Begin to gather data now that can help us isolate the evidence. So with a misfire of this type, the problem is also going to be affecting the fuel. So I should be able to see the problem or see what's going on by looking at the oxygen sensors. So I'm going to choose the parameters I want to look at, and I'm going to look at my oxygen sensor bank 1 sensor 1 and oxygen sensor bank 2 sensor 1. Now I'm also going to look at my short-term fuel trim and my long-term fuel trim, and I'm going to graph view them all. So as you're looking at this, you can see my top is my long-term, the middle is my short-term, bank 1, bank 2, and my oxygen sensor, bank 1, bank 2. Now this is with the key on, but the engine is not running. And you can see that my oxygen sensors are just a steady value. Now I'm going to start the engine and we'll let it idle. Okay, we've got to let it warm up, and you can see that the oxygen sensors are warming up and beginning to work. Again, bank 1, bank 2, and my short term. Now if you notice these numbers here, oxygen sensor bank 1 is around 130, bank 2 is about 150. Now this is in millivolts. Now an oxygen sensor should be switching somewhere close to 100 millivolts going up to about 900 millivolts. And these are staying very, very low. They're not switching at all. And if you look at our fuel trim, on bank 1 we're at 1% and bank 2 at 1%. Now these numbers here indicate that it is very, very lean. So we should see the short-term fuel trim adding fuel. This should be very high, and it's not. Now I'm going to raise the idle here a little bit, and we'll see what happens. Now I'm going to go to wide open throttle. Back to idle. Wide open throttle. Idle. Now if I pause that, now let's review the numbers. So our oxygen sensors are staying very, very lean. Our short term is not adding any fuel to compensate for that lean condition. If you heard me, I said a couple times that I went to wide open throttle. There was no change. So we're going to start this back up again. So something's not right here. What is it?
What is not right with this data? The O2 is an input signal. The short-term fuel trim shows what the PCM is doing in response to the O2 input. The PCM here is not doing anything in response to the O2 signal. So that's what's wrong with this data.
Is the engine truly lean, or are the oxygen sensors dead, or are they just not reporting right? Because whenever an engine is lean, we should see the computer adding fuel. The short term should start adding fuel. So what I'd like to do now is see if we can't force these oxygen sensors to report a rich condition. We're already lean. We could create a vacuum leak and make it lean, but it's already lean. Let's do the opposite and see if we can make it go rich.
So what would you do to test this data? Since the computer is not adding fuel, we should add fuel externally and see if the oxygen sensor responds to it, and if the PCM responds to that added fuel also.
So what I'd like to do now is see if we can't force these oxygen sensors to report a rich condition. We're already lean. We could create a vacuum leak and make it lean, but it's already lean. Let's do the opposite and see if we can make it go rich. So what I'm going to do here is add external fuel. The theory is if I add fuel, it should go through the engine, the oxygen sensor should see it and start reporting it rich. So I've opened up my propane tank, and it's on a regulated wand here so that I can inject this propane. I'm going to take my vacuum off. Seal that up. Now, when I open my propane, you ought to be able to see that on the scanner. So you can see our oxygen sensors are reporting very lean, and the fuel trim, they're not adding any fuel. So I'm going to open up the propane now. And you can see the oxygen sensors immediately reported rich. They went from very lean. Now look, I'm 900 millivolts on both sensors. I'm very, very rich. But look what happened to short-term fuel trim. Nothing. It's still zero. Even though I'm very rich, the computer is not trying to balance fuel and add fuel. Now I'm going to go lean again. Watch the O2s and the short term. So I took my propane away. My O2s went lean again. Now I'm down to 100 millivolts, but the short term did nothing. So I just proved my oxygen sensors are not lying to me because I can force them lean and rich. The computer should adjust to that because that means the fuel going into the engine, the computer should read the O2s and try and balance fuel. It's doing nothing. The short term and the long term on both banks of the engine are doing nothing. I drive my fuel rich. The short term does nothing. Both banks. I make it suddenly lean. We drive it lean again. The computer does nothing. So one tiny little glitch there, but that's not enough. The computer should be adjusting for this imbalance of air fuel. Now computers are logic devices. They are not sensor inputs, and they are not output devices or actuators. They simply get data, calculate and do things. In this case, the computer was not doing its job. Now, do you remember earlier when I was testing vacuum? The needle was firm and fixed. It was not bouncing. So that told me I don't have a mechanical valve problem, but my reading was low. So why was my vacuum reading lower?
What could make vacuum read low if the needle was steady? If the timing was off, it could affect vacuum.
Now, another thing to consider here is timing. What if the timing was off? Well, first off, that would show up in a bouncing vacuum needle. But let's go ahead and prove that the timing's on track. So this has two cam sensors, one on each bank of the engine. So I'm going to hook the lab scope up and look at the cam sensors and see if they're in time. So on my lab scope, I have two traces, yellow and green. One is the cam sensor on one bank, and the other is the cam sensor on the other bank. Now, as you can see, they both look identical, but what I want to do is line these up and see if they're totally synced. So I'm going to move the yellow one up and put it right on top of the green one. Now, if you look at it, they're identical. They're both peaking at the same time. So our cam timing is right on the money.